Tonight, by popular demand, he's back on the Daily Politics Today. Welcome, Douglas Alexander.
It's
Now,
good to be
you
here.
were, you almost sounded there like David Cameron, let sunshine win the day. Is this the new sunny Dougie?
Well, listen, I genuinely feel there are reasons to be optimistic about Britain. And I think one of the problems David Cameron has is his failure to paint any kind of picture as to what post-austerity Britain would look like under the Conservatives.
Vince Cable last week at the Liberal conference was pretty gloomy as well.
I think they were pretty downbeat. Listen, we've got huge challenges as a country, the economic crisis, the challenge in the Eurozone, the rise of the East. But I think we've got the strengths to match that challenge.
But it was sunny Dougie, and we've seen a little, we've had a preview of Mr. Ball's speech. It's sunny Dougie versus gloomy Balls.
Well, let's see what Ed has to say.
Well,
but I think... OK, why don't you share with me what you're concerned about?
It's embargoed.
Oh, well.
So I can't give you the details, but it's quite gloomy.
Well, listen, nobody is doubting that the challenges Britain faces today are huge. My sadness and disappointment is we've got a government that I think are making some of the wrong judgments and are making a bad situation worse. But on the other hand, I do think we shouldn't lose sight of some of our real strengths as a country. You know, I think most countries would give their eye teeth for the BBC World Service, for the National Health Service, for some of the great strengths that we continue to enjoy.
On domestic policy, there's obviously
I'm
lots...
slightly disoriented as a Presbyterian Scot being accused of being sunny Dougie, actually, so forgive me, I'll catch up with you in a moment or two.
I know it's a cultural difficult for you.
A novel line of
has put you on the back foot. Yes. Obviously, there are huge differences in, or certainly differences on domestic policy, but on your area of foreign policy, is there really that much difference? Let me ask you, for example, would your approach to the Arab Spring, had you been Foreign Secretary, been that different from William Hague's?
I think the government deserves credit for a big part of its approach.
On
specific issues, I think they got it wrong. The evacuation of British citizens out of Libya, I was forthright in my criticism. But I was also generous in my praise in the work that they did in getting the Security Council resolution. And Labour, despite all of the difficulties and the divisions within our own party on the issue of Iraq, was steadfast over those 6 months in supporting British forces playing their part in enforcing that UN resolution.
And on increasing international aid to 0.7% of GDP. That might not be very popular in the country and in the Tory party, but there's a consensus on that too, isn't there?
That's right. It was a policy that we started in government that the Conservatives have now decided to continue.
And as you told me last night, there's now a consensus on both front benches on not joining the euro for the foreseeable future.
Yes, that's true.
As well. So you actually... the one thing that I couldn't get quite clear from you last night was whether you shared the enthusiasm for what had been Mr. Blair's policy of liberal interventionism and now seems to be Mr. Cameron's policy of liberal interventionism. OK,
well, let's take both of those in turn. In terms of what Tony Blair said, listen, he set out his speech in Chicago in 1999. I think all of us, and I said this in my speech just a few minutes ago to the conference, recognise that any decision about intervention now takes place in the shadow of Iraq. And I believe, personally, that the bar of legitimacy, both here in Britain and internationally, has actually been raised by all of the concerns and disagreements about that conflict.
It's more difficult to do.
So I think it is very difficult to conceive that you would have seen the action that you saw in Libya, but for a combination of circumstances. My sense is, for David Cameron, he's desperate not to appear to be setting out a foreign policy doctrine. I'll leave David Cameron to worry about that. I think we should be informed by Iraq but not paralysed by it, and I think that's been our lodestar in our actions over recent months in relation to Libya.
John Prescott this morning, former Deputy Prime Minister in the Labour government. Now, just in case we have younger viewers, you know, I'm just explaining. There are some people in there, meaning the shadow cabinet, who are undoubtedly not carrying their weight. Does he mean you?
I don't know, you'd have to ask John. I mean, listen,
has he got a point?
What? No, to be honest, I like and admire John, but I'm getting slightly weary of former cabinet ministers edging back onto the stage with pronouncements about the condition of the Labour Party. I think, you know, most people recognise that our task is to pull together and to get on with the job of taking the fight to the Tory, not starting fights within the Labour Party.
There is a sense, though, that I mean, we've talked on this programme about Ed Miliband's need to establish himself and to connect with the British public. But what you say of Mr. Miliband could be equally said of the team, the shadow team as a whole. You told me last night how 35% of people think you're actually Andy Burnham.
Yes, I was quite flattered by that.
You know, you can regard that as a plus or a minus. And that even, I'm told, even 30% of people in Scotland didn't know who you were, too. So you, Mr. Prescott, I take your point about former politicians making headlines with these kind of statements.
Politicians,
but he might have a point.
Always struggled to leave the stage, and in that sense, you know, John's made a huge contribution to the Labour Party, but it is the job of a new generation. But let's be honest. This is the first Labour conference with a hiatus of last year apart in 20 years where the dominant figures haven't been Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, John Prescott, John Reid, David Blunkett, others. And in that sense, we fully accept we've got a responsibility both to take the fight to the Conservatives and campaign, as John was urging us to do, but also to allow the public to get to know us. So I think maybe our interview last night was a start in that longer journey. I look forward to many more discussions in the months ahead.
So do I. Just briefly before you go, Mr. Miliband can now choose his own shadow cabinet. He doesn't have to follow the votes of MPs to choose it for him. Are we right to expect a reshuffle soon?
I genuinely don't know. You'd have to ask Ed. I personally thought it was daft to have elections to the Shadow Cabinet. I voted against it even before Ed made the change, and I was delighted when Ed made that change. I think he should be able to pick his team. It's up to him who's the team and when he picks it.
But you're not looking for your P45 yet?
Not yet. I haven't heard rumours to that effect.
Twice in 24 hours, Douglas Alexander. You can have too much of a good thing.
Same time, same place tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's the Shadow Foreign Secretary there.